they get more comfortable with the space. But back to my study, yes, their partners did have an influence, and some of them just were in such a desperate place of struggle
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
like seeking help from somebody else just seemed like the best answer. In addition to that, many of these participants and Latino men were men of faith. And so like they also sought out religious or spiritual leaders. And
Hmm.
then that potentially was the segue to them being encouraged to seek out therapy. And so just different stories, but different experiences. But 13% or 100% of my participants all took the risk to go to
Wow.
therapy, which I think is just it was a really beautiful and meaningful study to me. And I'd like to get it
Mhm.
published one day. I just haven't really
Yes.
given attention to it. So
Shame and guilt often weighs heavily on men, silencing their stories and locking them into cycles of self sabotage, of emotional struggle. And today I have a special guest, Dr. Zachary Trevino, and we are inviting him to the Heal and Manifest podcast. He is a licensed marriage and family therapist based in Lubbock, Texas, specializes in couples therapy and in men's mental health. As a faculty member in the Antioch University in Seattle, he combines clinical expertise with a passion for teaching, empowering clients and students alike to embrace growth and connection. So, in this episode, we'll explore how men can navigate shame and guilt, break through societal expectations, and really find healing and heal their heart. So, Dr. Zach, welcome to the Heal and Manifest podcast. How are you?
great. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am Dr. Zachary Trevino. It is nice to finally meet you. This is one reason I really love Instagram is that it allows us to connect with people across the globe, across the country in a very meaningful way. And I always take these opportunities as just a privilege. And so just thanks for inviting me into the space. Super glad to be here.
Of course, thank you.
Yes.
And you know what? I work with women, right? But I do also work with men. And I do think that there's a lot of stigma in for men seeking out mental health therapy, seeking out help and support. And because of that, I think that bringing on awareness in men's mental health is so important. And we know that there's like higher statistics in like suicide, right, for men. And it's something that we don't often talk about. And I'm curious for you in your work that you've done, what brought you into doing this work with couples, but also with men?
Yeah. So I think the intersection of my personal and my professional life have
Mm-hmm.
led me to this meaningful work to me. Obviously, growing up, I'm a third generation Mexican American, and so I
Mm-hmm.
grew up in a very traditional Mexican household in a traditional culture, had a traditional cultural experience. And I don't want to overgeneralize here, but I think we all know what I'm talking about here when I say those things.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up seeing dad, parents, siblings,
Mm-hmm.
family members struggle with expressing emotions, especially within our own Latino community, and didn't have the space or the blueprint to understand emotional experiences and emotional articulation and emotional regulation. And so as a young boy, I found myself in my early adulthood. I found myself on the couch in therapy for the very first time as a
Mm-hmm.
client. And at that time, I was also actively working to become a first generation college graduate. And I didn't know what I wanted
Mm,
to do. I didn't know what type of career I wanted to pursue. I didn't even believe I was capable of like getting a bachelor's degree. But long story
mm,
short, the personal and the professional kind of overlapped on
mhm,
the therapy couch. And what I mean by this is that my experience being a Latino in therapy was so transformative. My entire life pivoted, just
mm,
emotionally more mature, but also having more clear guidance and self awareness to make choices for myself. And
mhm,
ultimately wanted to be able to serve people in the way that my therapist at that time served and helped me. And so it's a combination of life, just like personal life, and also just professionally, knowing I wanted to be educated and I wanted to help and give back to my community, but I didn't know in what capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little bit of both of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I have been saturated in my field and in this field, the more I see the significant need for Latino male therapists, but also um, the need for more people like me to
Mm-hmm.
utilize these services and to be able to take the risk to do that. So yeah,
Yes, thank you for sharing that. You bring a very important point around Latino male therapists.
yeah,
You guys are like unicorns because we don't see
yes,
we don't
yes,
see you guys that much.
yes,
And I think that's very telling. That's very telling, even just like in the mental health field, but also in the Latino community,
yeah,
right? And that is slightly changing and shifting right now because we have more Latino men, therapists that are out here like providing education on mental health and emotions, how to navigate challenges, relationships, which I think is so needed because sometimes what I do see a lot is that with men is that they don't have the role models
yeah,
to sometimes, right, they don't maybe have a father figure or whatever is it in their situation that they where they were allowed and given space to express their emotions. It was there was a lot of shame, there was a lot of guilt of like, you have to man up, all of these limiting beliefs, like you have to
yeah,
man up, you have to take it all in and be strong and stoic. And that creates a lot of internalization of negative self concept, right? But also for for how to navigate emotions, how to
yeah,
navigate relationships,
yeah.
right? Tell me a little bit about what do if you were to define shame and guilt, I would like our listeners to understand the differences and how it shows up for men.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So I'm gonna backtrack though because
Mhm.
there's something I was thinking about here is
Mhm.
when we think about Latino men, just the general person,
Mhm.
even scholars and academics, the thing we think about is the concept of machismo, and the connotation attached to machismo is often negative. That
Mm.
it's strength and stoicism and self reliance and just dominance. And I'm not saying it is those things. I understand that there
Mhm.
are concepts connected to some of those potentially negative things, but
Mhm.
there's nothing wrong with inherently having this, embodying this is the people we
Mhm.
come from. This is somewhat in our DNA, and it's not all bad. And so I think I just want to preface this with like, it's okay
Mhm.
to embody masculinity and strength, and but to also recognize some of it can be problematic and some of it can really serve us. And
Mm.
I'm so annoyed with the literature and framing machismo as it
Mm.
being absolutely bad and disservicing to us. I'm not justifying
Mm.
that it's all great. I think
Mhm.
it's important that in context we have to understand this is a part of who we are. This is
Mhm.
generational, and it
Mhm.
doesn't all have to be bad. In fact, if we can understand and befriend this concept, we can better learn how it serves us and helps us, and how it even hinders us, our
Mhm.
relationships, our parenting styles, so on and so forth.
No, you bring a big point. Thanks for
Yeah,
naming that because
yeah,
this is something that I see a lot in my clients too and in my community, right? Especially working with a Latino community and even with women, right? I think that women, we do have a very unique and different experience with machismo
yeah,
because and it's not that I think there's a difference with machismo and masculinity and healthy masculinity, right?
yeah,
Yes, there's nothing wrong with embodying masculinity, with being a provider, with being strong, with supporting, with providing, with protecting. Those are
right,
all great, amazing qualities that we all want. Yet what happens when there's trauma, historical, systemic issues, trauma, all of these things. What
yeah,
happens when that occurs, right?
yeah,
In our communities, what ends up happening is that people abuse the power and control.
yeah,
And that comes, we know that it's systemic, it's
yeah,
multi-layered. It's not just like, oh, you're a machista and it's bad and you're bad. No, it's like, it's so entrenched, ingrained in the intergenerational trauma that we carry in our DNA, that sometimes people operate in survival in that. And I'm not justifying abuse or any these
Yes.
dysfunctional toxic dynamics or cycles, but that's what happens, and people don't understand that. And
Yep.
yes, I'm 100% with you around, like, let's not demonize machismo, but let's reframe, right, how we, what is masculinity at its
Right.
core, and how can we shift it and reframe it and heal and go and move towards a place of healing, a place of embodying um more of a
Yeah.
healthy masculinity, more
Yeah.
healthy masculinity. I don't
Yeah.
know what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely. I think the question here should be, what's the purpose that these things serve? What's the purpose of
Exactly.
Marianismo and Machismo? Like, what's the purpose they're serving? And how are they disservicing us as leaders, as fathers and parents and sisters and daughters and brothers? Like, how is this serving us and how is this disservicing us? Um, I think that's the big question here, right? Like, we can be curious about this rather than be critical and say that these things are all good or all bad. But what might the purpose of this be? And this segues perfectly into this shame and guilt that many men who sit on my couch experience. Um, is so back to your question of talk about what shame and guilt is. My understanding and my perception here is that shame is a feeling of being inherently flawed. It's often tied to this identity that I am bad. Whereas my conceptualization and understanding of guilt, on this other hand, is about actions. I did something bad. I'm doing something bad. And so one is I am bad, and the other is I'm doing something bad. And these emotional experiences of shame and guilt can really erode our sense of self, our self concept, our ability to heal, to grow, to evolve, to change. But it's something that I often see when encountering men in my clinical practice is a lot of shame and a lot of guilt.
Yes, and how does that show up? If you were to give me, say, an example, or a situation or a case scenario when it comes to shame, and guilt, and how it shows up, say, in men's lives, in their relationship, in their work, in how they view themselves, can we get a little bit of a feeling of how that may look?
Yeah, great. Yeah. So, in what I see, shame and guilt often manifest as anger, as withdrawal and avoidance, perfectionism, right? Like trying to overcompensate these feelings of shame and guilt with high internal expectations and an overcompensation of trying to prove that I'm the most athletic or I'm the most whatever it is, right? Working harder to make up for our perceived failures and discomfort with feeling of shame and guilt. And so it shows up in many ways in relationships. It shows up, yeah, in that manifestation of anger. It shows up the very minute a client comes to walk into my therapy room and sits on my couch in front of me, because taking that step to ask for help when we've been socialized and conditioned to not do that is breaking the rules for Latino men, for men in general. And so it is something that I think really can limit men and even relationships from achieving their fullest potential. And yeah, again, eroding at people's self-esteem and concept and believing in themselves. So I think that's what I would say here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you bring up great points. And I thought a lot about the expectations, right? The societal expectations, the cultural expectations, and sometimes it's so internalized. And I think now we're seeing a lot more, and I always bring back to the what is relevant in these times right now, right? We think about social media, how are people relating to each other? What's the algorithm, how's the content out there? And I think sometimes I'm just like, wow, like people have very skewed concepts or constructs about how men should be right now, and how, there's this concept of like, now it's like, I don't know if you've seen this, but in the dating world and relationship world, it's like it's become so materialistic.
Mm.
So I don't even know what the word like.
Yeah.
I cannot even describe it, but very much like, oh, I just want you to provide and financially, right? And I think that that is a big, big thing that we're seeing right now in
Yeah.
social media. What are your thoughts on what is out there
Yep.
and that,
I,
all of
I,
that information?
yeah, along these lines, I think social media and just media influence directly impacts our scripts and narratives about what men need to be doing and what women need to be doing, and that type of thing. Like the things that we see and consume largely shape the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a female, what it means to be a good partner, right? Um, and what it means to even ask for help or to say I'm struggling. And I do see a shift, and I see a cultural shift happening where there are men making healthier choices to invest in themselves and go to therapy, who are taking that risk and taking that step. But I think we're still far off. Um, we're still far off, and I think there's still more work to do here. Um, One thing I was thinking about here in my research during my doctoral program, my final dissertation study, the final project to, you know, get my doctorate degree, I conducted a study where I interviewed Latino men who had gone to therapy. And it was a very meaningful study, and I wanted to understand how did Latino men get in the therapy room? How did they benefit from therapy, and what did they learn? But what I'll say here that I think is relevant is that 100% of my participants said, I didn't know that therapy was an option. I didn't know that I could go to therapy. I didn't know that doing this was and even an option. Like people like us don't go to therapy. They don't go to therapy. And at the conclusion of my study, 100% of my participants also said, all Latino men said, I could have saved myself relational heartbreak, trauma, all kinds of things if I would have known that I could have gone to therapy earlier, but I did not know. And so it was just a very meaningful, beautiful study of eliciting the stories and the narratives of these men who broke the rules, and asked for help and said, I can't do this on my own. And I think this goes along with just like expectations of men and what we expect of them. But men need permission to be able to say, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to show up feeling shameful and guilty. It's okay to ask for help. And so I'm kind of in a rabbit hole here, but we've been socialized to not think to think it's too vulnerable or you're weak for asking for help. And I think that's the narrative I'm trying to challenge here, is that it's not that.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm
Hmm.
curious what brought, like, how did they came to therapy? Did their wives and their girlfriends send them, or?
It varied across participants. There was a
Okay.
handful of them who their partner had an influence in that process, and
Okay.
even in my own clinical practice, I do see that
Mhm.
men getting into the therapeutic space is heavily influenced by their partner
Partner.
dragging them. But
Yeah.
with time, with patience on my end, with meeting them where they're at, they get
Mhm.
comfortable and they buy into this process. As I meet them where they're at, as I address the social, societal, cultural norms, as we address
Mhm.
the shame and guilt that they're experiencing very directly, they get more comfortable with the space. But back to my study, yes, their partners did have an influence, and some of them just were in such a desperate place of struggle
Yeah.
that like
Yeah.
seeking help from somebody else just seemed like the best answer. In addition to that, many of these participants and Latino men were men of faith. And so, like, they also sought out religious or spiritual leaders. And
Mhm.
then that potentially was the segue to them being encouraged to seek out therapy. And so, just different stories, but different experiences. But 13%, I mean, 13 or 100% of my participants all took the risk to go to
Wow.
therapy, which I think is just a really it was a really beautiful and meaningful study to me. And I'd like to get it
Mhm.
published one day. I just haven't really
Yes.
given attention to it. So
No, and I think it may come with time, right? As you
yeah.
kind of like put yourself out there. I guess I'm curious, what are some of the biggest fears men express when they come to therapy for the first time?
Mm, yeah. The fear of not being enough or good enough, that I'm not good enough. The fear of commitment, I see that pretty common. I don't want to generalize here, but I see a lot of men with avoidant attachment styles. I also see a lot of men with anxious attachment styles. But it's the fear of not being good enough. It's the fear of I'm not the best father. I'm not the best dad. I'm not the best spouse. A lot of those kind of core negative core beliefs, um, and a lot of fear just around confronting myself. I've most people spend much of their life avoiding these things, and the risk to confront ourselves, the risk to vocalize insecurity is really, excuse my language, fucking scary for men. And so it's a very gentle and slow pace that I meet these people at. And part of it is just meeting them where they're at and helping get buy-in by often helping men recognize you've done what you've been told to do and you've been doing what you've been conditioned to do, given your social and cultural context. You don't know any different. There's not been a blueprint here. And so I think it's just meeting men where they're at and really gassing them up for taking the step to go to therapy, like hyping them up. This is a big deal. This is a big deal.
Right.
So
That's a good one. Thanks for sharing that.
yeah.
I guess I'm curious, what you do work with couples.
Mm,
And I know you've mentioned right now that some of the common issues are like some of the common struggles are not feeling good enough. Also the avoidance, right? At the end of the day, there's maybe abandonment, rejection, betrayal, all of these different wounds that have not been healed. And when
correct.
you do work with couples, what do you think are some of the struggles or challenges when it comes to working together? If it's with men and in couples.
Yeah, great question. So in thinking about this, I'm thinking about my very traditional heteronormative male and female relational constellations where I'm working with a male and female. And most of my work is with monogamous couples as well. Um, what I often see is the dynamic of one person being more emotionally expressive and one person being more internalized and
Mm.
avoidant and preserved. And that person is often the male identifying partner. That
Mhm.
said, there's so many times I run into the dynamic of I want him to share more with me.
Mhm.
He holds his cards too close. He doesn't share. I never know what he's feeling. He's not anxious. Sometimes he's just in the garage working. And so I see a lot of anxious and avoidant pursue
Dynamic.
withdrawal dynamic. Yes.
Mhm.
And I think that in that dynamic, I see both the anxious and the avoidant, the male and the female, embodying these attachment styles, if you will,
Mhm.
and doing the best that they can with what they know how to do.
Mhm.
And that perhaps that they, because of our socialization and experience of denying our emotions, there's a helplessness and an overwhelm that comes for men in terms of being able to meet their partner's needs. And so in that helplessness, they pull away, they shut down. Um, Given going back to like the perfectionism in men, if their partner usually broaches them with, I need your support, I often see them resorting to, well, I just can't get it right. I'm never going to be good enough.
Mm.
And so just a lot of
Mhm.
pressure, a lot of self criticism, and in really working to attend to that dynamic, I often really help men who shut down and become critical of themselves to become curious about what's
Mhm.
happening for them. And
Mhm.
this is often deeply connected back to childhood experiences of feeling invalidated and dismissed
Right.
and being instructed to go to my room when I was having an emotional experience. And so a lot of internalization, a lot of isolation. And I don't know what to do in these moments when my partner is asking me these things and asking me to share. I don't even know what I'm feeling. I don't know how to even articulate
Mm,
that. So a lot of it is helping men to step outside, to zoom out just a bit, and
mhm,
to become curious about what happens when these big emotions, what happens when shame shows up, what happens when guilt shows up. Okay, so you
mhm,
shut down, and in response to shutting down, then your partner does this. So it's a lot of just zooming in and zooming out on one partner, zooming in and zooming out, and
mm.
helping the couple recognize their individual process and how it help informs how they show up in the relational dynamic. So I'm
Got
going
it.
into the rabbit hole about couples therapy, but it's my
No,
jam.
I love that.
Yeah, yeah,
Me too.
yeah, yeah,
And I guess I'm curious for one, like in the couples, right, the partner, right, in this particular scenario or case that you're sharing, what can the partner do, right?
mm,
What How can they support men? Because I think that we also play a role, right, if we're talking about heteronormative relationships, etc. I think women also do play a big role in the dynamic,
yeah,
and we're all big conditioned in our own ways, right?
yeah,
And as you're talking about attachment styles and childhood traumas, relationship traumas, and experiences and expectations, all of these are so layered. But
yeah.
how can the partner support a man's kind of journey in opening up and holding space?
I don't want to be so overgeneralized here, but what I really see fairly often is the women, the female identifying partner wants their partner to open up, and then when they do, in their own way, that they know how to, they get invalidated or dismissed. And so
Mm,
then it confirms I try to open up, but when I do,
yeah.
this is what I get. I get defensiveness, I get justification. Like, so I think it's just important for in supporting your partner to ask yourself, what's my role here? Right? What is my contribution to this cycle? And what role do I have in my partner pulling away, shutting down, anxiously pursuing me harder? Like, I think asking yourself, what is your role here in this relational dynamic?
Mm,
And is there something you could do different? Because I also believe you, this person I'm referencing, is probably doing the best they can with what they know how to do. Right.
yeah.
And so I think it's asking yourself, what's my role here? Is there something I can do differently?
Hmm.
But also, even very directly asking, how can I support you here?
Mm,
What do you
that's a
need
big
from
one.
me? What do you need from me? What am I missing here and what am I not understanding? Right. What I often reference here in my clinical work in regards to couples therapy, I'm going to pull out my clipboard. So,
Yeah.
like, one partner has an experience of things and the other partner has an experience of things.
Hmm.
And we get so caught up in justifying our posture and our position that we lose sight of
Hmm.
the opportunity to say, tell me more about your experience of this. Tell me
Hmm.
more about this. And that's my goal in couples therapy, regardless of being Latino or whatever the
Hmm.
case may be. It's
Yeah.
helping men and women and couples and relationships to slow down, to work together against the conflict, and to try to hear
Hmm.
each other out. But
Hmm.
sometimes we can't do that when we've been socialized in a society that says abort all conflict, don't feel emotions, you're weak if you try to show vulnerability. Like, those, all those processes inform this relational dynamic. And so it's so fun. Couples therapy is so challenging, but it can also be so fun if we lean into the process of growth and say,
Hmm.
I don't want to repeat generational cycles or generational patterns. So yeah,
It's powerful. It's amazing
yeah,
work, and yeah, like as you mentioned, it's hard, but it's definitely worth it because, as you mentioned, I think you brought up the big point around um, what role am I playing in this dynamic? Because we all play a role, right? Whether we like it or not, whether we see it or are aware of it or not, and whether we are aware of our triggers, because that's what's going to trigger how we respond
yeah,
to to how, how our partner is sharing their emotions, right? So
Yeah.
understanding also ourselves and having that self-awareness of what is it that triggered me. Is it maybe a wound of of abandonment, of rejection, and like communicating that in an open, vulnerable way, and that can lead to connection, right? That can lead to more curiosity, and vulnerability.
Yeah.
And because we've all been socialized in a certain way,
Yeah.
we have to really unpack that and unlearn that, and
Yeah.
learn ways that we're going to get to to be open and vulnerable and connect.
I think that the work of like men in therapy and couples therapy, it goes hand in hand in that men often are having to confront these things because it comes up and manifests in the relationship, right? Like if
Mm-hmm.
you're single, you're probably not having to, you're avoiding attachment style or your anxious attachment style. Like the symptoms of those things aren't always present because you're not in a relationship with somebody. And so when we are in relationships with others, these dynamics begin to show up, and we're kind of forced to deal with some of those unresolved, untreated childhood wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think relational constellations of like couples and relationships is the bridge, or can be the bridge, to
Mm-hmm.
helping men work on individual unresolved, untreated things. Now I'm also of the firm belief that we can treat those things in the context of the relationship. That's my
Mm-hmm.
systemic training, and that's my, yeah, my relational training background. But I think the relational work can be the bridge to getting men to also doing their own work. um, so
I love that. And
yeah.
I 100% agree with that, because we heal in relationship too, right?
Mhm.
How are we going to know we have a lot of unresolved, maybe childhood traumas, or if we don't, if like, if we're not in relation with others, if we're not maybe having certain conflicts, certain things come up,
Yeah.
that needs to be resolved. So
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
100%. What are some like practical, maybe strategies or things that men can do to start quite like being curious about shame and guilt, and like
Mm.
really navigate these big emotions that come up?
I think what comes to mind and what comes to my gut here is that as men, we have to take the risk to be real and honest with ourselves. I think many men spend much of their lives in autopilot, high demand, produce outcomes, results. And not all that is bad, but I think it's subconsciously an avoidance of sitting with self.
Hmm.
Hence why I continue to encounter men who are afraid to slow down, men who have to be in the garage, who have to be watching something, who have to be listening to a podcast where they're working. I think this work starts in terms of practical strategies. We have to slow down and be comfortable with ourselves and be honest with ourselves. I often tell many of the men I work with, if we half-ass our truth, the healing's going to be half-assed. It ain't going to be long-term or sustainable. And so I think it requires us and
That's true.
demands,
Yeah.
yeah, like we have to be willing to take that risk,
Hmm.
to be introspective, to be honest with ourselves, and to take inventory of our lives and who we are and what we become and what behavior we're engaging in. And we have to ask ourselves, what's serving me? What's working for me? And what's no longer serving me and what's no longer working for me. As adult men, as adults, we have agency and autonomy, and we get to decide what we take with us into the future and forward, and what we leave behind.
Hmm.
And so maybe we come from generations of abuse and alcoholism. I mean, I certainly come from abuse, addiction, violence, divorce.
Hmm.
It takes one person to step outside of that and break those patterns. But if we're going to go to different places, it requires us to do something different beyond repeating those patterns. So very practically, we have to be real with ourselves instead of avoid and numb. often with
Mm.
substances. That's what I see many men do, use substances. And I'm not saying substances are bad. The question is, what purpose do they serve? But we
Mhm.
have to be real with ourselves. Um, and I think in that transparency and honesty and sitting with self, we have to be willing to say, I'm hurting, I'm alone, I'm insecure, I'm afraid, I don't know who I am. And then I think along that, I mean, this, I could go into a rabbit hole here. In that transparency and honesty with self, we open up the door for the possibility of change
Mm.
by choosing to recognize something's not working. I'm tired of running from myself. I don't like this person that I am. And in opening up that door for the possibility of change, I don't think that therapy is the end all be all. I don't think that the only answer here is therapy. I don't think that
Mhm.
even accessibility to therapy is an option for many people. But
Mhm.
what I will say here is that the work starts by being honest with ourselves and then choosing what we do in response to that.
Mm.
What do we do in response to these things?
Mhm.
How are these things affecting my physical health? Where do I feel these things in my body? So on and so forth. And so I think therapy is a starting point for this work beyond being honest with yourself. Um, but very practical beyond therapy are things like practicing mindfulness, breath work, movement, physical activity, support groups, spiritual and faith communities. Um, Investing in these in yourself in these ways to be able to process and make meaning and make sense of these things. Um, so yeah, I think that that's what I would say in response to this.
I think that's a
Hmm.
great way to start. I mean,
Yeah,
and because like you said, and we've been talking about, nobody teaches us how to break these cycles. We
yeah,
have to step out of that, and that often requires us to step into that discomfort, to step into that change, to step into the unknown, even though, you know, we've never, maybe men have never seen anyone model that before,
yeah,
but that's when you get to the point where you're like, you know what, I'm done with this doesn't serve me. Maybe it did, right? As you mentioned, asking themselves, how does this serve me? And maybe
yeah,
it served me when I was in survival mode, but I'm no longer wanting to take that with me. I'm wanting to break these cycles and patterns that are no longer helping me have a healthy relationship with myself. Maybe these ways that I'm thinking about myself, they're not good for me because I'm criticizing myself. I'm in this negative inner dialogue. I'm being so critical and judgmental about myself, and it
yeah,
does, and I have all these unrealistic expectations, and that is not how I want to live my life, right?
yeah,
I don't want to live my life stuck in this cycle of self-sabotage, in this cycle of maybe violence, in this cycle of addiction, right? Not only addiction to substances, but there's a lot of other addiction. Now we're seeing addiction to technology, addiction
yeah,
to social media, addiction to porn, addiction to so many other things. And that we know that it's a coping mechanism. It's a survival coping mechanism
yeah,
because I think it's hard for men already to look inside and to be honest, but really asking yourself, like, what do I how do I want who do I want to become, right?
mm,
Who do I want to become? What do I want to take with me? What legacy I want to take with me, and what kind of person I want to be, right?
yeah,
What kind of father, what kind of husband, what kind of man do I want to be? And
yeah,
these are all important questions, right? That um, Dr. Trevino mentioned, and that we should, you as men should start asking yourself. And
yeah,
it leads to that journey of curiosity, of self discovery, and of healing.
yeah,
And I would say to definitely seek out community, right? The importance of community and, men's circles, healing circles, you know, um, therapists that you can, connect with, coach, anyone, right? Anyone that you feel like a role model, elderly, right? Your church or faith community, whatever is it that will lead you closer to that person, that version of you that you want to become, do
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah, yeah. Something you brought up was a few times you brought up like not having role models, and the amount of men I have heard say, I walked away from childhood knowing who I did not want to be because
Mhm.
this version that I experienced with my parents or my dad was unhealthy and abusive and addicted. And so what I say in response to that is you may have walked away knowing who you didn't want to be and what you didn't want to repeat, but that doesn't mean you knew what to do instead. Just
Mm,
because I knew I didn't want to be abusive or I didn't want to talk to my children that way doesn't mean I knew the skills or what it took to be a healthier alternative, right? And so
mm,
I can know I don't want to be like this, but that doesn't mean we know what to do instead because we don't have a blueprint. We didn't have somebody model
mm,
this, and so we can aim to be different and to break cycles. But if we don't have a blueprint, if we don't know how to emotionally regulate or how to cope, part of therapy is being able to help us in that. In my opinion, like
mhm.
if I knew I didn't want to be this, then what does it mean to do something different, and how do I get there? What tools and what skills and what resources do I do or have to be able to get there? And so
Yeah.
I firmly, firmly believe with everything in my being that we do the best we can with what we have, the knowledge, the
Mhm,
resources, the all of those things. We do the best we can with what we know how to do at any given
mhm.
moment. And so even in the idea of like I didn't have these role models, perhaps generationally speaking, our family and our ancestors did the best they could with what they knew how to do. And perhaps we are the people our ancestors were waiting for to be able to pivot away from dysfunctional
Mm,
patterns, from diseased patterns of living consumed
mhm.
by addictions and abuse. And it just takes one person.
Yes.
It just takes one person. And
Yeah.
it's incredibly brave for people to take that step. It's incredibly brave to say, I want different, and to turn away from a lineage of abuse and violence. Um,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
that's the reward of this work is to sit with people willing to do that, to sit with men, to sit with couples.
Mhm.
That's the most rewarding part of this work in helping people redefine health and love and relationships and all these other things. It's so rewarding. And I think that that's what fuels my work and my passion in
I love
supporting.
that.
Yeah.
I love that. For the
Mm.
listeners that are listening now, who maybe men who are struggling, what last message would you like to give them?
Mm. Yeah. For those who aren't men, who aren't Latino men, I'll
Mhm,
say this. There are men in your lives struggling. There are men in your life or in your circle or in your proximity who don't know how to ask for help. There are men in your life who don't know how to say, I need help or support. And so I would encourage you listening to ask yourself or to take inventory of the men in your life and when's the last time you simply said, how are you really doing? Like
mm,
super simple, super simple.
mhm.
But that opens up the conversation. It opens up the door for, again, possibility and opportunity. So there are men in your life who are struggling. My question to you would be, when's the last time you took inventory of that and asked someone how they're doing? To my men struggling who are taking the time to listen here, if
Mhm.
that's you, I would say so many things. I would like to speak to a younger boy inside of you who potentially had some traumatic, adverse childhood experiences. I would speak to the young boy in you who felt alone and isolated and misunderstood, overlooked, not good enough, was told to suck it up.
Mm,
In whatever way that is consistent with you and resonates with you, I would simply say that young boy is probably still experiencing some of those things and showing up today in different ways, and that you're allowed to ask for help. You're
Mhm.
allowed to say, I don't know what I'm feeling. You're allowed to take to take the risk to ask for help, and that it doesn't define your reputation. It doesn't change your relationship status. Like, it's okay to ask for help.
Mhm.
It's okay to ask for help. And that on the other side of this risk, healing can happen for in whatever shape, form, or fashion that it needs to happen for you
Mhm.
if you choose to take that risk. So just fucking do it. Like, I can't take that risk. Like,
Yes.
you deserve to give yourself some attention.
I love that. Thank
Yeah.
you so much
Yes.
for this conversation. It's been fruitful. It's been amazing, and I hope that anyone who is listening, that you share this with your loved one, because at the end of the day, men, we all have men in our lives, right? We all
Yep.
have men in our lives who are probably struggling right now, and that really need to hear this episode and need to hear these words of encouragement, that need to seek out for help and support and seek out community so they can start giving themselves the chance, right, to heal, to break cycles, to show up for themselves, in whatever way they want to, and the person that they want to become. So thank you so much. How can people find you? How can our
Yeah.
listeners find you?
Yes. Thank you again so much for having me. Thank you for the space you hold on this platform, and just the voices that you amplify here, and the way in which you meaningfully contribute to the world through this
Thank
podcast and in your
you.
own practice. Just shout out to you. Seriously.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you.
incredible. So I am a millennial who loves social media. It's clear here. I go back to like MySpace and
Mhm. Same, same.
yeah, long story short, people can find me on Instagram, and my handle is just at Dr. period Zach Trevino, ZACHTREVINO. Instagram is a fun platform that I use to spread awareness about these types of concepts, but also as a way to just normalize help seeking in a
Mm,
very humorous and authentic and fun way. And this is how I met you. And so, just yeah, thanks for having me here. It's quite the
yes.
privilege, and yeah, just super grateful and feeling invigorated after this conversation. So thank you.
Me too. Thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. Trevino. And thank you for
Yes.
everyone who is listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe on YouTube, follow in all of your favorite platforms, and we'll see you on the next episode. Bye.